Hey, welcome to our paints models. Today we're going to be painting the Gitz of Zarbags Gitz. Now, this colour scheme would also work well for any Moonclan Grots, Gloomspite Gitz, any other cave-dwelling goblin that you might be thinking of. So I'm going to start out by airbrushing a lot of base colours. I'm actually going to start out by painting the net of the netter here, because I found it was a lot easier to do it this way around. I'm going to base coat that net with BMA Armour Brown. You could also use RHINOX Hide from Games Workshop. That will also be very, very close. Now I'm going to do a zenithal highlight with ZANDRI dust. This is much faster than trying to actually paint this by hand with a brush, which I tried to do already. This guy got stripped about 3 times trying to figure out a good way to paint this net. You want to just catch the top sides of all of those bits of string in the net, whatever they are. And now we're going to use Terminatus Stone to do our last highlight on here. Note that I'm kind of leaving it darker towards where the grot's hand is. This is to accent the whole kind of bunching up of the material there, also to add a bit more depth to the shape of the net. So now we're going to be going on to the green skin for the goblins. I'm base coating this all with CASTELLAN green. For the netter that you would have done earlier, just mask off his net with some post attack and you'll be fine. Now I'm going to do a zenithal highlight with ELYSIAN green. This is a very kind of bright yellow green. I was going for a brighter skin tone on these grots than I normally do on greenskins. I'm shooting my airbrush at about 30 psi. It's a Hardware Steenbeck Evolution with a 0.4mm needle in it. This is all just trigger control and quite thin paint here. Just being very careful to just get it where I want it. I'm going to do another highlight with OGRYN CAMO, mostly just focusing on the tops of the arms and the nose and chin on the face. Now I'm going to do the final highlight with Terminatus Stone. So I'm just catching the very tip of the nose, very tip of the chin, and the kind of knuckles on the hands there. So now, as you can see, I've masked off all of my skin areas with some post attack. Ready to do the clothes. So I'm going to base this with BMA Panzer Dark Grey. This is a very dark grey. It's slightly brown. There isn't a good Games Workshop equivalent for this, but if you mix some black with some STORMVERMIN fur, you'll get quite close. So now we're going to do a highlight with STORMVERMIN fur. I'm actually focusing this around the bottom of the robes. This is to make the robes look more tatty and worn. So I'm focusing it around the bottom of the robes where the wear is, and across the back of the shoulders, and if they've got a hat, towards the pointiest bit of their hat. Another highlight, this time with DAWNSTONE, which is covering a much smaller area than before, but in the same areas of the clothes, using the same logic. So now you can see what it looks like once all the airbrushing is done. Before we move on to the rest of it, I'm going to shade the skin with a Chthonian camo shade. Just clean it up with a slightly damp, clean brush if it pools a bit too much on the tops of the arms, for example. Don't let it flood the face too much, you just want to get some definition in there. And I'm going to do the same with Nuln Oil on the rest of the robes. Again, don't let it flood the flat surfaces too much, just use a damp, clean brush to pull it off. If it floods it too much, you'll end up with it pooling far too much towards the bottom. Gravity is a terrible determinator of where shadows should be, but this gets us pretty close. Now I'm going to start by highlighting the skin and the face. I'm going to be using OGRYN camo, just picking out some of the sharper details, so the cheekbones, the bottom of the chin there, and the fingers, and if their elbow is kind of bent, I'll be highlighting their elbow as well. At this point I'm using a size 1 Rosemary & Co Series 33 brush. Now I'm using a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and OGRYN camo, and I'm just using this to layer up a kind of reddish nose on the goblins here. Just painting that in, pulling from closest to the face towards the tip of the nose. This isn't really glazing, I'm just layering it up here. I also use this to base coat the bottom lip on the grots as well. I will also be using this as well, I just remembered, to paint their ears if any of them have ears that are visible. Now it's pure Cadian Flesh Tone, just covering a smaller area than before, making sure to get the ridge of the nose with it. Now it's a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and MEPHISTON Red. Again, covering a slightly smaller area than before, just towards the tip there. Just to make those noses look all ruddy. You may find you have to go back to a previous colour that you've mixed in order to blend it in better on the noses. I certainly did. So you can see how I'm just kind of blending it a bit with the previous colour. Just go back and forth until you get it right. If your paint's thin enough, you should have no problems. Now I'm just using pure MEPHISTON Red. Now this is relatively thin. I am painting the eyes with this. It's difficult to see because of the hood, and I've got a big old head magnifier on to make this easier, but I'm using the tip of the brush to paint the eyes. So just base coat it in with MEPHISTON Red. It might not be easy to see all of this all the way through because, again, it's hard to record this. But just base coat the eyes with MEPHISTON Red, and then we're going to do a tiny dot of Wild Rider Red in the middle of those eyes. I'm just using the very tip of the brush. Now if you're trying to do this for a big force, you can stop at MEPHISTON Red, jobs are good, and you won't need to do any more. I do recommend doing something on the eyes though. Unfortunately, goblins have got pretty big eyes. Next we're going to be doing an even smaller dot of Fire Dragon Bright in the middle of the previous colour we did. You need a very fine tip on your brush here, and a head magnifier helps a lot. I'm doing the biggest eye on this guy. Now, same with ELYSIAN Yellow. And now DORN Yellow, which is a very tiny dot in the middle of that eye there. Then I'm going to take some Army Painter Dark Tone. You could also use Nuln Oil for this, but I prefer the Dark Tone as it dries a little bit darker. And I'm just going to flood the eye sockets with that and make sure it's not sitting on top of the eyeball. This just gives it a kind of nice it looks a bit like eyeliner, to be honest. Ups the contrast on the eyes. Now I'm going to base coat all of the teeth with Zandri dust. And then I'm just going to highlight them with some titanium white. They've got very, very small teeth, these grots, so just doing the two colours works fine. You just need to leave a tiny bit of Zandri dust closer towards the gum. But this white will make them look nice and sharp. And finally, I flood the mouth with dark tone, just to give it a bit of depth. We'll start out with the clothes by highlighting all of the edges with Administratum Grey. This can be a relatively time-consuming process. Again, if you're doing a whole army, you can probably skip this step. Now I'm going to do a bit of cleanup with VMA Panzer Dark Grey. This is pretty much it really for the clothes with the brushwork. It's relatively time consuming though, because there is a lot of edges and there is usually a lot of cleanup to go alongside it. Again, if you wanted to just leave it as it was from the airbrush, then you can do that and it'll be a lot faster. Now I'm going to paint all the ropes around their belts with Zandri dust. Any other bit of rope or string as well that I want to be as cut, I'm doing that at the same time. And then I'm going to shade it with Agrax Earthshade. I don't mind at all if this overflows onto the robes a bit, it actually will give it a little bit more definition. And if it goes over, you can kind of just feather it out with some water. And no one will notice. See, you can't tell. Now I'm going to use USHABTI bone, and I'm just going to use this to pick out each section of the rope, making sure to leave the shade colour and a bit of the Zandri dust showing. Now we're going to on to all of the details that are specific to the archers. So I'm going to paint the bow with Zandri dust. I also paint the staff weapons that the rest of the grots have in exactly the same way as I'm doing the bows here. So I won't be covering those later. But they are done exactly the same way. I'm also base coating the quivers and the pouches with Zandri dust at the same time. So now I'm going to paint in my highlight area with USHABTI bone. As you can see here, I'm blending between USHABTI bone and Zandri dust. This is a wet blend, just to create a transition towards the USHABTI bone at the very end of the bow. Since this is mostly wet blending, it's relatively organic. It's difficult to say exactly where to draw the line here. I'm just creating a nice transition from USHABTI bone at the top of the weapon down to Zandri dust closest to the grip. In my head, the goblins' weapons are all made out of bones, so this might be a rib bone from some kind of big old cave squig that they use as bows. So I'm painting them up to look quite a lot like bone in this particular instance rather than wood. Now I'm highlighting it with titanium white. I'm doing a kind of a mix of wet blending and edge highlighting here. I'll wet blend in the very end of the weapon, but I'll take the edge highlights much further down the weapon. Now I'm going to take some Agrax Earthshade and I'm going to run this about halfway down the weapon into the grip, and I'll then use some water to feather out the Agrax Earthshade further up the bow grip there. This is just to add a bit more colour, a bit more contrast down towards the grip. Now I'm going to paint the pouches with BALOR brown. Now I'm doing this basically on the sides of the pouches. So if you imagine that Zandri dust is our highlight colour, so it's facing the light, which is up. We're going to have RHINOX hide as our shadow colour, so that'll be facing down. BALOR brown is facing out to the sides, essentially. Oh, sorry, it was DOOMBULL brown, not RHINOX hide. Yes, DOOMBULL brown is our shadow colour. You can see I'm painting it into the undersides of everything here. This is quite a thin consistency, I'm mostly glazing it in. I'll also go back with some BALOR brown and just kind of feather that as well a bit. Yeah, like that. I'll then go over the entire quiver with some Agrax Earthshade. This is just to pick up the folds and details in there, also to create a bit more of a contrast between the quiver and the rest of the model. Again, don't let it pool too much on the flat surfaces. When it's dry, it should look like that. Now I'm going to take some RHINOX hide. We're going to base coat in all of these strings that we've got going across the pouch here. I'm going to take some Zandri dust and we're just going to kind of lightly tap the side of our brush against those strings. It picks it up really easily and it creates a nice little kind of texture that looks a little bit like rope, even though there's no texture sculpted into them. It's a little bit like edge highlighting, but you're just kind of tapping rather than stroking across the edge of the model there. And we take a USHABTI bone and do the same, but just on the top light facing parts of the rope. Again, same random tapping pattern. Just creates a little bit of extra texture. Now I'm going to paint the wrappings on the bow with Ulthran Grey. I imagine these as being cloth wrappings. Just using the tip of my brush and being careful to leave the dark colours that are already there in between each of the wrappings. I'm also going to use this to paint in the arrows. I can't remember what that bit's called. Someone told me in the comments once and I can't remember for the life of me what it's called at the moment. Fletchings! Is it the fletchings? I think it's the fletchings. Comment below if it's the fletchings. Then I'm going to run some army painted dark tone over all of those white areas. The army painted dark tone has a tendency not to sit on the flat surfaces quite as much as Nuln Oil. I think it's got a little bit of gloss varnish in it, so it flows into the recesses a bit better. Nuln Oil gloss would also work, probably quite as well. But this is what I had to hand. Now I'm going to use RHINOX hide, and I'm going to use this to paint all of the leather areas. So on the archers it's going to be their boots, but on the Squig Herder he has gloves, and I'm also painting these at the same time with the exact same technique. Now while that's drying I'm going to be using ZANDRI dust just to paint in the shafts of the arrows here. Again, just leave a little dark area between each one. Now I'm using Scrag Brown, and I'm kind of painting with the very tip of my brush little kind of squiggly patterns and a kind of an edge highlight on the leather areas. I'm just picking out areas where I think there might be damage or the leather may be worn and cracked. So random patterns work really well for this. Now I'm going to take some USHABTI bone and I'm just kind of touching it against the edges. Again with that tapping motion to create a kind of randomized pattern of texture. These are the most cracked areas on these boots and on this leather. The areas that are very damaged, exposing the fibrous part inside. Now I'm going to use some very thin RHINOX hide and I'm glazing this over what I've just done on the leather in order to kind of unify it and deepen the shadows a bit. These guys have a lot of mushrooms on them, and I painted all of them pretty much the same way. Start off by base coating them all with MEPHISTON red. It'll probably take 2 or 3 layers of thinned down paint to get a nice smooth coat on these, and you do want a smooth coat because these guys can be, they show up brushstrokes quite well because they're such smooth surfaces. Now I'm going to do a mix of MEPHISTON red and titanium white. I can't tell you exact ratios here because they're very different consistency paints, but I'm basically just trying to give myself a slightly pinker version of MEPHISTON red. You could also use Wild Rider red if you wanted it to have a slightly more orange tinge. I think I did do that on a few of the mushrooms that are on the base of Zarbag. I'm going back with some MEPHISTON red, just using some glazes to smooth out those transitions there. As you can see, I painted the highlight color in the area that I believe the light is going to reach it, so the upwards facing areas. I'm going back in some titanium white, picking out all of those little spots on the mushrooms. And I'm also going to be painting a highlight along the tip of the mushroom here. This is supposed to be kind of where the shine is occurring off the mushroom's cap. So yeah, I've also painted the underside of the mushroom there with USHABTI bone. And now I'm washing it with Agrax Earthshade. On this model, I also paint that pin that's holding his cap in place with VMA steel. I actually paint all of the metallics after I've matte coated the models. So all of the metallics happen at the end. Give your models a nice matte coat to dull everything down, and then go in and do the metallics. Speaking of which, this is more specifically the metallics for the characters, so the Squig Herder, the Fanatic, and Zarbag himself. I did all of their metallics the same way. Start off by base coating them with VMA Gun Grey. Helps if you paint them all black as well first, but you don't have to. It will cover eventually. Now I'm going to take some VMA black and I'm painting this into the shadow areas of my metallics. So you can see how I'm painting this into the underside of that little cauldron brazier thing that he's got on his back. And into the undersides of the plates that are overlapping. On the Fanatic, this made up approximately the bottom third of his ball. As you can see here, it just makes it a little bit darker and gives a little bit more brightness to the lighter areas. Now I'm going with VMA Steel and I'm kind of edge highlighting all of those metallics, but I'm also going to paint this onto any of the upward facing surfaces. Now this is Armour Wash. The recipe is down in the description for this. Basically a mix I've been using on a lot of my Warhammer Underworlds miniatures of 4 different washes, plus a little bit of gloss varnishes in there as well just to make it flow a bit better, and I'm washing this over all of the metallic areas. Once it's dry, it looks like this. Now on to the Squig Herder. So this is stuff that's specific to the Squig Herder, so we're going to be doing all of the fire effects on him. So I'm going to start by base coating these coals with Ulthuan Grey. You don't have to get full coverage, but you do want this to be thin and you want to work it all the way down in between all of the coals, because it's going to be our brightest area, which is going to be between the coals. So I'm going to take some EIRE yellow and I'm going to just paint the coals, leaving some of that Ulthuan Grey in the cracks. So this is kind of the opposite to how you would normally do it, where you leave a shadow in the cracks. Here we're leaving the lightest colours in the cracks. So now taking Fire Dragon Bright and just leaving a little bit of that EIRE yellow showing, just blocking it in a bit more. Now we're taking Wild Rider Red. Again, same process here. Just leave a little bit of all of the previous colours showing, just the smallest amount. And it doesn't really matter if it covers fully, because we're going to be building this up over a lot of different colours, and variation is good. So now taking some Khorne Red. You can see getting down to a very, very small area on our coals here. Now RHINOX hide. We're nearly done. Such a tiny area now that's being painted with this. And ABADDON Black. This is for the kind of the coldest bit of our coals. Once all that's dry, take some LAMENTERS yellow and just wash it all over the coals. work it right down in between them, and also let it overlap onto the brazier a little bit. It just gives us a little bit of a glow. It won't be anywhere near as bright as it looks when it's wet. Then take some Nuln Oil and just work that around the very outside of the brazier, just to give it a little bit of kind of ashy burnt look, because I realise there isn't actually any depth or a lip on this cauldron, but it would have one in real life. Next we're going to be painting the branding iron. So I've already done the metallics on this. I've gone over with it post-attack off with some surface primer and painted it black with the airbrush. Now I'm going to create a gradient using some Mechanica Standard Grey. Just covering kind of the bottom 2/3 here of the smoke effect, leaving the black at the very tip. Then doing the same with some Administratum Grey, just creating a much brighter gradient down towards where the actual branding iron is. Also catching the underside of that smoke to make it look as if it's being kind of lit by the glowing metal from underneath as it rises away. And finally some Ultron Grey for our brightest spots, which are going to be on the metal itself. Now we take some Lamenter's Yellow through our airbrush, and very carefully we're going to spray this over what we've done in order to tint it. So we want to leave some of that brighter, whiter areas on the smoke and on the metal, but mostly we're going to be tinting this yellow. Dry fully, and then we're going to do the same with Bloodletter. This time we're focusing the Bloodletter more towards kind of the corners of the moon symbol there. The areas where the metal will have gotten colder, that's going to be more orange. And with the branding iron, the outside cools down before the inside. Now we're going to be using VMA Armour Brown. You could use RHINOX hide here as well. And just very carefully catching the corners of that Bad Moon emblem. As you can see, I'm testing on my thumb to make sure I've got a very small dot. And that gets us our branding iron. And the next stage is going to be using some Abaddon Black, and this is a Green Stuff World sponging stick, but any piece of sponge will do. And we're just going to sponge that on the very outer edges of the branding iron. You could also edge highlight this if you wanted to. I'm using a sponge for a bit more random variation. And this is where the branding iron has completely cooled, but it wouldn't go back to looking like metal because it'd be covered in soot and carbon and burnt flesh from a squig. Now it is the Shaman. Now there's only one bit on the Shaman that's actually unique from everything else, and that'll be his little spite, fairy, whatever it is in the little cage that he's carrying there. So the mushrooms are all painted the same way as everything else. The white mushrooms are actually just Ultron Grey and Administratum Grey blended together. But this guy, we're going to base coat him all with Ultron Grey. This will take a few coats to cover smoothly over the black. Don't rush it, you don't want to get too rough of a texture on this guy because we're going to be putting a glaze on him later which will show up all of that texture if you have some. So we're going to put Guilliman Blue on here. This is neat straight from the bottle, you can see it in the background. And we're just running this into all of the deepest areas. And it doesn't matter if it overlaps a little bit onto the metallics, that's fine, makes it look a bit more glowy. And while it's still wet, I'm using some Ultron Grey to kind of blend in my brightest areas. So I want the actual body of the spite there to be brightest, and also the tips of the wings. then once it's dry, I'm going back in with some Ultron Grey. I'm doing edge highlights on the wings. I'm just going to reinforce that bright spot on the center of the spite. And then finally I'm using some titanium white to paint the very brightest spots. And this is what really sells it as being kind of a lighting effect. You've got to go all the way to white if you want to have an object source light. Hey, that rhymes. Hey. Next up is the bases. I did all of the bases the same way, but every single one of these bases has got something unique on it, and I'm not going to cover that here. So I'm just going to cover the generic part of the base. Start by base coating it with BMA Dark Grey Blue. Dark Reaper from Games Workshop is also pretty close. Then I'm going to spray Dawnstone, and I'm going to do this as if the light is coming from the front of the base. So the back of the base behind the model is going to be darker than the area in front of the model. And I'm also letting, one side of those stalagmites, stalagmites, be in shadow. And if you're lucky, they'll also look like they're casting a shadow. So now we're doing the same with Administratum Grey here. Just letting the texture of the base pick up all of the detail, using a very shallow angle. Then using some Praxetti White on a dry brush. And I'm only dry brushing from the front of the base towards the back of the base. And a little bit across side to side, but mostly from the front to the back, just to pick up the very brightest edges. You don't have to use Praxetti White here, any white that you can dry brush with will work. Now I'm covering the base with clean water, very important that it's clean. This is going to give the base, make the base nice and damp. And then, as you can see, I'm going to apply some Nuln Oil, and because of the water, it's just going to go shooting straight into the cracks and the crevices without it having enough time to actually kind of dry straight away and create any coffee staining. You can then use another dry brush to just clean it up a bit. And there we have it, Zarbags Gitz. There's a lot of these guys. You can check out my channel for the part 1 in which I painted the squigs. The link to that will be in the description below, and it might even get recommended over to the side there. Now, I didn't show you how to paint the glass effect on the Fanatics bottle there because I wouldn't recommend it. I actually don't like it that much, but I left it in. Thank you to all of my patrons who have funded this video. You can see all their names scrolling up the screen there. Without them, I wouldn't be able to do this. And if you liked that video, please click like, hit that subscribe button, turn the bell on for notifications. You can check out my Patreon, there's a link on the screen there. YouTube also thinks you'll like this video, and you can check me out on my social medias where you can catch up on work in progress and such. So thanks for watching, bye!